Chapter 27. Pressure, check. Temperature, above freezing. Oxygen content, high enough for her to survive without a suit. The urge to pull off the helmet and remove the artificial second skin was maddening. The longest duration she'd ever spent in a suit was 10 hours, and that was back in boot. It was part of the Hell Week that all SFMC personnel attended during indoctrination. Assuming you passed, most Marines would never step outside of a ship while in space, ever again. If you didn't pass, you'd either be drummed out or given an assignment in the rear with the gear. She'd often wondered just how many of the commanding officers in the SFMC hadn't passed their training and became ass-sucking bureaucrats as a result. Not that it mattered. They gave the orders. Marines either died or survived, carrying them out. But if she ever saw Colonel Hayes again, she might get drummed out of the SFMC for slugging the pompous bastard. Those thoughts were for later. She crouched next to the autodock waiting for a sit rep from her fire team and for Elliot to wake up. The former should report in soon. The latter, well, there was no telling when he'd come to. She hoped that by the time he did, they'd have a suit ready for him. Kelly's HUD flashed yellow. When Dickerson and Carb had left the room, traveling out into the corridors to the emergency station, she'd pressurized the room, set the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, and waited for the room to stabilize. When the pressure normalized to 0.5 atmospheres, she'd activated her external audio sensors. Now they were pinging her. She stood from her position and followed the HUD arrows with her eyes. A vent near the ceiling rattled. She increased the sensitivity and listened. The suit removed the sound of her own breathing so she could focus. The rattle ceased and started again. Heart thumping fast, she reached in her belt and pulled out a nanoprobe. The short, thin, stick-like device came to life, her head lighting up with a view from the probe. She pushed the probe upward. In ZG, a nanoprobe could function for up to an hour of constant motion and data gathering. Outside ZG, you were screwed. For that, you needed a real drone, one that could roll across surfaces and jump over obstacles. She hated the larger drones. They were easily jammed, easily thwarted by demolishing any ingress-egress points a drone could use to search, and were a pain in the ass to carry. The probe floated until it reached a meter from the vent. Kelly piloted it through the grate and inside. She switched the probe to infrared to look for targets, but quickly switched back to normal view. The heat flowing through the vent was more than enough to cloud the probe's ability to find other signatures. She'd almost have to decrease the heat flowing through the vent to find a target using the heat sensing technology. The white light flowing from the probe's head lanced through the gloom, but only with a narrow beam. Something moved at the edge of the darkness. Kelly frowned. Did they miss something? Mira had been in vacuum and absolute zero for 43 years. No carbon-based life form she'd ever heard of could withstand that. But the pine cones can, she thought to herself. She piloted the probe until it was near the corner. The light caught the edge of the moving shadow again. She held her breath and waited. The shape moved toward the probe. In the glare of the white light, she saw it for what it was. A pine cone. Only not just one. There were 4 of them she could see, all clogging the vent. The first one undulated its body and floated toward the probe. "Oh, fuck," she said. She watched as a claw slid from its bottom. Kelly piloted the probe backward. The pine cone followed. She wasn't sure, but it looked as though its companions were too. The probe left the vent and she stopped at a few centimeters from the grate. The light stabbing through the vent's darkness illuminated the pine cone's nubby surface. It was at the vent. Her audio sensors picked up a new sound. The rattle of the pine cones bouncing inside the vents gave way to the sound of crunching. She raised her helmet, cut the probe feed, and stepped as far away from the vent as she could, her rifle aimed directly at the metal grate. "Dickerson, Carb, we have a problem," she said.
"Corporal, we have a suit and we'll get back pronto. What's your situation?"
She tried to slow her breathing, but her voice came out in a rasp. "I have hostiles in at least one vent." A scratching, rattling sound came from her left. She checked her suit cam and noticed another vent entrance near the door. "Make that 2 vents."
"Pine cones?"
"Yes," she said. "What's your ETA?"
2 minutes unless we jet."
"Jet," she said, the word barely audible to her own ears.
Corporal.
She kept her rifle pointed at the vent above the auto dock, but continued peeking at the other vent through the cam. Kelly connected to Elliot's block to check his status. He was still unconscious. Good. At least he wouldn't wake up in time to see a bunch of... The screech of cutting metal filled the room. A second later, the vent exploded into metal splinters. The shards propelled outward like flechettes, only at a much reduced speed. The first pine cone floated out of the vent, its razor-sharp claw lanced in the air as if on instinct. It rotated in the air, which made no sense. Her audio sensors registered another screech of metal. She flipped her attention to the cam focused on the other vent. It, too, had detonated. Another pine cone floated through the first vent, followed by 2 more. 6 of the creatures floated out of the second vent. Each of the strange animals undulated their bodies and all headed for one spot in the room, the auto dock. Kelly aimed at the original cluster of creatures and pulled the trigger. A flechette round ate the short distance in an eye blink and then exploded into a storm of electricity. One of the pine cones burst into blue flame. The sound overloaded her audio pickups, and they shut down before blowing out her eardrums. A shock wave from the explosion flung the other 3 pine cones in different directions. One slammed into the wall, while the other 2 flipped end over end to the floor. She swung the rifle, aimed at the second cluster, and fired. Their grouping seemed to spread apart, and the flechette hit the wall, the Atmos steel flashing blue with the current. The second cluster split into 2 groups of 3, each flying at a different altitude. Her audio sensors filled with the sound of crackling and scratching. Kelly looked back to the original cluster. The 3 remaining creatures had descended on the auto dock. "No, fuckers!" she yelled, and scrambled forward.
Corporal, we're at...
"Get in here!" she screamed. "Now!"
But...
"Do it now!" Kelly kicked away from the deck and cut her magnetics. The pinecone creature's claws scratched and tore at the transparent aluminum bubble. She hit her jets and flew right above the auto dock. She used the butt of her rifle to knock one of the monstrous things away, driving it into the wall with an audible crunch.
Corporal, the door won't open. You need to kill the gent...
"Blew it!" she yelled. She halted her progress using the suit jets and knocked at another. It flipped fluidly in the air, brandishing its single metallic-looking claw. She felt it scrape the rifle's metal with a squeal. A single short-lived boom hit her audio sensors just before all the oxygen rushed out of the room. Without her magnetics, she flew sideways toward the door, arms and legs flailing for purchase. One of the creatures bounced off her visor as it swept by, pushed along by the surge of the decompression. She activated her mag gloves and set them to the highest level. Her hand grazed the side of the wall and stuck fast, the rest of her body still trying to fly out the door. The shock nearly pulled her arm from its socket. Screaming in pain, Kelly fought to put her other glove against the wall, and then the pressure was gone.
We're coming, boss!
Harb yelled. Kelly pulled herself to the floor and activated her boots. She mag-walked to the auto dock just as she saw Carbon Dickerson through her rear cam. "If you see those fucking things, shoot them!"
We're clear, Corporal,
Dickerson said.
They flew out the medical bay entrance. One hit my arm on its way out.
She nodded to herself and finally reached the auto dock. Deep scratches marred the bubble's surface, and a spiderweb of cracks had spread across the transparent aluminum. Yellow status lights glowed on the auto dock's panel. "Watch your 6, Kelly said, "and one of you watch the vents."
Got it, boss.
Harb said.
Is that where they came from?
Kelly didn't respond. Warning lights began flashing as the auto dock vented both O2 and CO2. "Shit, Elliot's losing pressure."
How long?
Dickerson asked. "Maybe 3 minutes. After that, he's dead," Kelly said in a monotone.
Fuck that shit.
Through her rear camera, she watched him demag and jet back to the medical bay entrance. "Dickerson, what are you doing?"
Trying to save his damned life.
he yelled. Kelly turned to Carb, the spare suit floating next to her. "Fuck the vents. Get over here with that,"
Aye, boss.
Carb said, and followed orders. Dickerson flew at 2 meters per second to the medical bay entrance. He managed to clip the doorway from the trauma center, but he barely noticed. The moment he reached the pressure door, he cut his forward momentum and jetted down to the floor with a hard shock to his knees. To open the door from outside, he'd fired an explosive flechette. The round hit the wall just beside the door's lower left corner. The resulting explosion took a chunk of the door with it. The explosive decompression widened a hole large enough for him to fit a fist through and get the door raised. Now that same hole in the hatch's steel was going to prevent them from pressurizing the bay. When he left the trauma area, he wasn't sure what he was looking for, but knew he'd find it. He eyed the pile of corpses in the corner, still tethered to the wall. "Fuck it," he said, and jetted to them. He pulled a blade from his belt and cut the line. The corpses floated from the wall with the inertia. He grabbed the shoulder of a woman, turned, and jetted back to the door. "Corporal, I'm going to create a temporary seal. Get ready to pressurize."
Temporary seal?
Kelly asked. "Don't ask, just get ready." He lowered himself to the floor next to the partially shattered door and pushed the corpse against the hole. He didn't know how long it would hold, or even if it would. With the atmosphere vented, the entire medical bay's temperature had dropped back to near absolute zero. The corpses, if they'd thawed at all, would have instantly refrozen. He hoped the block of ice that had once been a human being would be enough. All they needed was 2 minutes, maybe 3, to get Elliot out of the auto dock and into the suit. Something moved in his peripheral vision. He turned his head, and his breath stopped. While he'd been grabbing the corpse, or hell, even before that maybe, a large group of the pinecone things had made it back into the medical bay. They floated in a tight formation like a flotilla of SV-52 fighting craft preparing for an attack.
Pressurizing,
Carb said over the comms. "Wait," Dickerson said. "Those fucking things are back."
we are out of time.
Kelly yelled.
Do it.
He said a prayer to the void and pushed against the corpse to try and form a seal. The corpse stuck fast as the room began to pressurize. Dickerson stepped back and tugged on the corpse's shoulder. It didn't move. He grinned. "I bought us some time," he said. "Now." He froze in mid-sentence. The pine cones had changed direction and floated toward the trauma room. He brought up his rifle, switched to stun rounds, and fired. The flechette zoomed through the ZG. Several of the creatures seemed to sense it and tried to move, but they weren't quick enough. The round smashed into the middle of the cluster, hitting one of the monsters and exploding in arcs of electricity. The shockwave pushed the others into the wall, but they quickly reformed and continued to the trauma room. Cursing, Dickerson pushed off the floor and jetted after them.